At this point, most of your drilling and cutting are finished, and the instructions supplied by Rocky Road Outfitters suggest putting the radiator shroud back in at this time. In their installation, they did cut that in half and need to zip tie that in. We used the fine tool and made a nice, clean, small cut, and as you can see, it remains strong and intact and stable. So we get to skip that step and move on. This is now time to reinstall the factory wiring back into the plastic crosspiece. I've used all of the supplied hardware that was supplied by the factory and went back into the original holes. Just in the center, above the Fairlead, is where you're going to have to change things up a little bit. I'm going to use the drill, punch a hole, and reinstall all the parts. As you can see, the factory push pin isn't quite lined up with the part where we're going to reinstall it. Use a small screwdriver, insert it into the top just above, and work it around a little bit. That's going to loosen up the band. Then give you room to move the push pin where you need it. The Rocky Road Outfitters instruction for the installation of this suggested that with the winch would come some styrofoam or foam blocks that would help keep this inside bezel from rattling in the wind, because a few of the clips have been cut off. We were unable to find that foam in the winch box, but nonetheless, a couple of zip ties properly placed inside and around the outside part of the fairing and the inside piece of the plastic bezel will keep things from rattling. Now it's time to reinstall the bumper cover. It's a large, cumbersome piece, so I suggest having a helper. As you hold it up into place, I suggest at this time to go ahead and reattach your fog light wiring. Make sure it's nice and secure. Reposition everything and start to move across. Now that we've got the plastic bumper cover back attached to the body and the fender well, it's time to reattach. Don't forget to reattach the bolts that attach it to the underside and near the skid plate. Tighten your skid plate bolts once you've got the plastic bumper fairing back underneath it. Once the plastic bumper cover has been reinstalled and everything's secured, it's time to reinstall the fender flares using the 10 white plastic clips once you've inserted all the tabs back into their proper places. Once the fender flares are reinstalled back into the proper holes, the white clips just slide right in and secure it in place. Now it's time to reattach the area around the headlight and bezel to the body. Notice that when we took those out, there are the same number 10 millimeter bolts, except one difference is that the washers are slightly different sizes, too large and too small. The too small go on the outside, and it's a little bit difficult at times to get this one to line up. The next small one goes on the top. The two larger ones go on the inside, and once again, they're very difficult to access. Nonetheless, they really tighten up that headlight. The smaller nut, goes on the inside of the fender. During this step, we reattach the lower part of the fender to the upper part of the fender using the 7 millimeter screw. applied. Right here on this bit of flange, it is important to note that there's an alignment peg that needs to clamp everything together. Once you've got everything aligned, it goes together rather well. Once the upper and lower part of the fender are put back together, we can reinstall the fender liner. Be careful and make sure to reposition that liner inside the fender flare. Make sure the tabs on the bottom are up inside the fender flare. Locate the clip. Alright, now I'm reattaching the fender liner back inside the fender well. Make sure that all the tabs are on the inside. I've repositioned all the number 8mm screws back into their clips. If you remember early in the video, we had to drill out a pop rivet from the bottom here. We've come up with a pop rivet with a large diameter backup, and we've gotten some small washers. They're going to back up the back side of it so it won't pull back through the plastic. Makes for a really nice installation. Now this is time to reposition the radiator shroud. We're going to leave out the push pins at this time, although on the passenger side I can secure a few of them, but on the driver's side I'm going to leave them off until we get the wiring for the winch all in place. We're ready now to install the Fairlead to the steel bumper. For this installation, we opted to get the optional license plate holder, which will go underneath the Fairlead. We found it easier to do this and get this attached before we mount the bumper on the vehicle. For this installation with the Warren winch, we've decided to make a slight cut in the bumper plastic in order to allow the clutch lever to be actuated. I've used a grease pencil to outline where we're going to cut. Installing the steel bumper, we've rounded up the 19mm bolts, lock washer, and spacer. The bolt's going to go through the front of the bumper, spacer on the back, and we'll lift this into place gently in order to get this put into place. Now we've also pulled out enough of the winch line in order to feed through the Fairlead. During the initial installation of the steel bumper, the spacers that were provided that are 4 inches long were put in place. As we positioned the bumper against the vehicle, we noticed that there was a significant gap between this new steel bumper and the plastic bumper. We removed all of the hardware and positioned the steel bumper against the vehicle and used a tape measure that was small enough to fit inside the holes to measure what we needed. Figured out that about 3 3/8 was the number that we wanted. Fortunately, we have just the tool here to do what we need to do to shorten these spacers, and that's what we're doing. We're cutting them down to 3 3/8 and going to reinstall them with the bumper. We went through an initial fitment of the steel bumper brush guard to the plastic bumper and realized that the provided spacers were a bit too long and we didn't have a flush mount against the bumper. As you can see, we cut a little over a ½ inch off of the spacers, but that also required that we trim down our bolts a bit so that they didn't hit the winch. They're very difficult to see. I think you'll just have to take our word for it and check it out, see what's working for you, and if you do have to cut down your spacers, we recommend that you take down nearly as much off of your bolts before you put them back in. That way they aren't pushing through, penetrating through the bumper and hitting against the housing of your winch. So, in all honesty, we've had some difficulty installing the bumper with the brush guard onto the vehicle. Wasn't anything that couldn't be overcome, but it took a little reasoning and thought process, during which we also found out that we had mounted the license plate holder mount, which has quick attach screws, upside down. So we reversed that, and now we're able to get the license plate holder on there once we're finished. The instructions mention not to tighten down the bumper quite yet until we're done mounting the Warren box, which has proven to be quite difficult. This is a newer model winch. The instructions don't really refer to this, so we're going to reason through this a bit. So it's going to take us a while. Nonetheless, some of the things that we're looking at that are very important is getting the control box far enough forward that the hood is not going to touch it and hit it. Also, you need to be able to work the latch to raise the hood, and then at which time, once we get this mounted, we'll go ahead and tighten everything up and move forward. Now, as the install nears completion, one of the last things we need to do is reinstall the tires. Alright, it's time to mount the winch controller onto the bumper. One thing I can tell you for sure is models change, things change, and it's hard to keep up with them. This part, you better be ready for a bit of a challenge. After considerable debate, we looked at many things. The bracket that was supplied is never going to work with this particular top. The only thing we found at this particular time, other than drilling through the bar, which we could have done, we were a little concerned that the bolts, if we mounted the winch controller directly to the bar with bolts going through the bottom of the bar, we were a bit afraid that it might crystallize and break the bolts. Therefore, we used some pipe clamps, reconfigured them a little bit, twisted them around, tweaked them up, and folded them around the bar. It's not exactly the look that I'd like, but it's not bad. We think this is going to be sufficient for now. Now, the bumper itself has all been tightened up. The winch controller is now tightened in place. Now, remember, we left the wiring for the winch loose so that we could find a way to route everything. I've had to take off the horn again just to get it out of the way, and now we're tightening up the cables for the winch, where the winch controller hooks to the winch. Now it's time to snug everything up and route the rest of the wires. Completion of the installation, and at this point we've rerouted all of the wiring for the winch controller. We've taken the ground and the hot wire along the bottom side of the shroud. I drilled a few holes in here and used zip ties to secure it up there. The horns have been reinstalled. We've brought it around and fished it around a few things here and got it hooked up to the battery. We've tested it and made sure that everything runs smoothly. We've put the guard on the cable, and now it's time to put the radiator cover on and put in the button. Final step in the installation is putting back on the radiator shroud with the push pins. Each of these, you make sure they're all the way out like this. As you can see, we've installed them. Once you get them stuck in, just push the buttons, stick it in, push the button. She's locked into place. Make sure all of them are down, and that's it. Rocky Road Outfitters. Warren winch, bumper setup with the brush guard.